Hey guys, it's Makeshift, and today I'm going to show you how to design applique in Embird. This is my embroidery program of choice. It's a one-time purchase. You need to purchase the base software, which is going to be able to open embroidery files and save them. You can do some editing, but you wouldn't be able to design anything, and for that you're going to need the Studio plugin. So it's relatively affordable. It's just a one-time cost, like I said. Some embroidery programs let you make you pay monthly. So it's just a one-time fee, which is nice. Although I did have to upgrade from an old version recently, and it was a paid upgrade when I got a new PC. So that wasn't the best, but I like Embird overall, and it's got its pros and its cons, but so far I haven't felt any need to explore a different program. So in the last video, you saw me prepare my pattern for applique, and here is what I'm going to import into Embird to trace over the blue lines, which are stripes that I'm going to be doing with the applique. So back to Embird, um, first what you want to do is select your hoop. So it's going to have a default hoop in here, and maybe you've set it yourself, but um, right here you can click on hoop, and if you click on this blue link right here, it's going to bring up a list of hoops. And so from here, you can just find the hoop that you're working with. Most of the time, I'm using this 5.1 by 7.1 hoop. This is the standard brother hoop for my embroidery machine. Like I mentioned in the last video, my embroidery machine has a maximum width of 5.1 and the height goes up to 7.1, but that's just a hoop with a single attachment point. For this piece, I'm going to use my larger hoop, which can go up to just about 12 inches. And it can do that because it has 3 different positions where you can set the hoop so that even though it's constrained by a 7-inch area, it can ultimately get up to about 12 inches just by doing some repositioning along the vertical. So this is the selection for that hoop, and this will flip it from vertical to horizontal, but my design is vertical, so I want to uncheck this box and then hit apply. So now my hoop is here, and you can see what I'm talking about with these 3 areas. So this total white box is about equal to 12 inches, but each of these colored areas here is one of the positions of the hoop. So all of your embroidery can go within this white area, but if you have something that goes down here and something that goes up here, you're going to have to reset the hoop at one point because your embroidery machine physically cannot reach all the way to the top or all the way to the bottom with just one go. So you have to actually pick up your hoop and reset it into a different attachment point. So now I'm going to copy my file, which again is exactly equal to my embroidery area of that hoop. So you can see here, this is 5.12 by 11.81. We go back to Embird and click that hoop, you can see that this is 5.12 by 11.81. So I'm going to paste this in, and it's going to ask if I want to scale my image to fit my current hoop. But I've already scaled it exactly, so this isn't really a concern. You can just hit yes, and this is still going to be the exact size of your pattern now imported into your Embird file. So now we can start designing our applique. And if you've ever done vector artwork before, that is a very similar concept to what we're going to do here, where we are going to trace these stripe shapes into this program, and then our embroidery machine is going to do all the hard work for us. We just have to design it up front. So MBird does have an applique setting, and that is right here. So this little button here, you can see at the bottom, it says create applique object. Two edges must be closed. So what that means is that if you think about a satin stitch, how it's wide, it has, it goes back and forth, the needle like this, where it starts on one side, goes to the other side, and then stitches back and forth, unlike a normal sewing line that just goes straight. So that's what it means by two edges, is that you're going to have two sides, the top of the satin stitch and the bottom of the satin stitch. And what it means is that by it must be closed is that you have to completely encompass an object. So that's one bad thing about Applique and Embird, and I don't know if that's the case with other programs, but my stripes are not closed. They are open objects because I want my satin stitch to go here, and I want my satin stitch to go here. I don't want my satin stitch to close off this object here and here, although it can, but I'm just going to be cutting off here at my pattern. So I could extend it out here, but I really don't want to. I just want a single satin stitch here and here. But to demonstrate that more, if you click once, you're going to start your satin stitch. Click again, you're going to start the other side of it. And then you need to select either side and start drawing your satin stitch. So if I click one side and go out here, this is the next node, and then you can grab this little circle here and adjust it. If I go back to the top and do the same thing, now I've got a satin stitch that you can move around. So I can make it wide, I can make it narrow. And if you click these nodes and click again, now you can just start tracing a shape. So what it means by close is that eventually you're going to have to come back to your starting point here on both sides. So if I just draw this random shape here, and then when you finish it off, you have to right click and hit end of segment, and then hit the checkpoint. And now you have this closed object. And what Embird is going to do for you is split this section into three pieces. First, you're going to have a basting stitch. So first it would do a long stitch around just about the center of this area, just so you know where to lay down your fabric. So it'll stitch first, and then it'll stop. And then what you do is you lay your fabric on top of that area. And then it's going to do a second stitch that's going to be tighter to attach the fabric to that area. And then you trim up the edges. And then finally, it's going to do a satin stitch all along this area that you've drawn. And so it does all that work for you, where you don't have to do those two initial stitches. But we can take some shortcuts to do that ourselves without having to enclose this area. But if you did have an enclosed object, you can just use this create applique object button and draw it yourself. But it is kind of annoying having to make these perfectly even yourself, and I found a couple ways around that, which I'll show you how. So I'm going to delete this object, and then let's start up at the top here. So this piece, like I mentioned in the previous video, it's going to be cut off here because my hoop is too small for this piece overall. So I'm just going to do my best and trace what I can. And so I'm not actually going to use the Applique object tool. I'm going to use this outline object tool instead. And what I'm going to do is trace along my blue line. I want to leave a little bit of room here because if you accidentally go beyond the boundary of the hoop, it's going to give you an error and you won't be able to finish it up. So I'm going to trace on the outside of the blue line. Eventually, I'm going to want the stripe to end where this blue line is. And I don't want it to be inside of the blue line. I want it to be on the outside of the blue line. And here you can also clean up any inconsistencies that you had in your drawing. So you can make lines a little bit more even and can space things out a little better if you need to. So again, you just click and then click into your next area, and then you can use the little circles to rearrange your line, and then keep clicking and you keep adjusting your circles until you get a nice even line and you trace your object. You don't want to use too many nodes. It can get overly detailed and you don't want to feed it too many nodes because it'll actually end up being a little bit messy. So just use as few nodes as you can and get the shape that you want. So I'm going to repeat this process for all of my stripes now. And when you think about the order that you do, you're going to want to keep in mind how your jumps are going to be. And I have my jumps turned off because it gets kind of noisy. But if you see this dotted line here, this is a jump, which means it's going to first stitch this top stripe, and then the machine is going to jump to this stripe and stitch this. So this is going to be some thread that is going to be on the machine, and it can get caught up and tangled. So you want to be smart about how you position the object. And if you don't position them as you go, you can just move them over here. You can right click and drag, and then when you let go, it gives you options to insert before, insert after. So if I did before, for example, you can see how now the first object is this bottom stripe, and this jump is a lot longer because it's going from the bottom of this one to this top stripe. So it's going to undo that and keep adjusting. I keep working on my stripes here. So I have a little inconsistent line here, but I double checked my pattern and I want to follow this bottom line. And you want to bring out your lines to your seam allowance. So my drawn lines stop before my seam allowance, but that's just because I drew on my lines while my plush was sewn together. I'm going to pull this one back just because it's getting a little close to the edge there and I don't want Embird to get mad at me. I'm going to do the thigh stripes first and then I will work on the tail area after that. And sometimes you'll click and nothing will happen. Just click your last node and then click again. You can see just how much uh, shape I can get with just like 3 nodes here. You don't have to add a lot of nodes to be able to get some nice shapes. And I'm just adjusting my pieces as I go. So some of them might not line up exactly with what I've drawn, but my drawing isn't perfect. Okay. So now I have my stripes. Um, the color doesn't matter so much. I pretty much just use whatever color as long as I personally know what color it's going to be. It doesn't really matter. Just if all your shapes that you're making are the same color. So all these stripes are the same color. If you do a color change, it changes or it inserts a stop. So if I said that this last stripe was going to be pink, it would sew all of these blue lines and then it would stop. And it would stop because it's letting you change your thread color, and then um, it will start again when you initiate the embroidery on your own. But we'll utilize color changes to insert stops in a little bit. So like I said earlier, I want my stripes to end where the blue line is. I don't want them to be any larger than where the blue line is. So keeping that in mind, there's a neat little function in Embird where you can take an outlined object and convert it into something different. So you see here, there's an option to create a column from an outline, and a column is just their name for a satin stitch. So if I hit create column from outline, it's going to pop up with this box, and this box is just asking how big you want the satin stitch to be, how wide you want it to be. For applique, I generally do a larger satin stitch because you want it to catch all of the fabric, and if you do something really narrow, you're going to run the risk of not catching all the fabric. So for this plush, I've been doing a 2.5 millimeter satin stitch. So if I hit OK down here, you're going to see that it's created a satin stitch around this outline. So let me just do that one more time so you can actually see it happen. So you click your object, go to convert, create column from outline 2.5 or whatever you want it to be. You hit OK, and you can see that column stitch pop up around. What I really like about this is that your satin stitch is now going to be perfectly even, whereas if you had to do this yourself with the applique object, you'd have to trace this and make sure that it's perfectly even, but you're not tracing this satin stitch, you're tracing this outline, which is just a single line, and then you have to make sure that it's even all by yourself. And that's really tedious, but this is doing all the work for us. But like I mentioned, you want your stripes to end where this outline is, and now your stripes are going to be a little bit larger because the satin stitch is poking out beyond your outline. But we can fix that. So what we do is we select all of our stripes and we go to transform and we hit shrink objects. And this is asking how much you want to shrink your object by. And we want to shrink our object by the width of our satin stitch, which is 2.5 millimeters. So now when I do this, it's going to make all my stripes smaller. So I don't have to guesstimate how much smaller my stripes should be. I can just make them the exact size of my embroidery or my lines, and then I can shrink them through Embird. And now I can uh, convert these to a satin stitch, and it will be perfectly even to the edges of my stripe. However, like I mentioned earlier, applique needs 3 pieces. First needs a basting stitch, and then it needs an actual stitch to attach your fabric, and then it needs a satin stitch. So we have our basting stitches now, but we need an actual stitch. So I'm going to copy, just Control C, all of these objects and paste it. And now I have duplicated all of my stripes. So now I'm going to convert them to a different color because I want my machine to stop after I stitch all of my basting stitches, because I need to be able to lay my fabric down on top of my basting stitches. And if this was the same color, it would just go back to the first stitch and to the first stripe and start all over again, and you wouldn't have an opportunity to lay down your fabric. So now that I've changed this color, it's going to stop, and then I will have the opportunity to lay down my fabric. And you can see the little indicator here with the thread here. What I'm also going to do is change the parameters of this stitch. So if you right click, just select all your objects, right click, hit parameters, and here the max length, I'm going to decrease it to 0.7 just so I have a tighter stitch, because this is attaching the fabric to my pattern piece, and hit OK. So now what I can do is go ahead and convert these to a satin stitch. And it doesn't actually convert, it just duplicates it into a satin stitch. So you hit create column from outline, and it was 2.5, and hit OK. And now our applique is perfectly lined up with the edge of our 3 lines where we drew them originally. And so we just did a whole lot of work in a very short amount of time because we used the outline tool instead of having to draw all these satin stitches by hand and making sure that they're all even and perfectly aligned. So the one thing you do want to do is to double check some of these, because sometimes it can be a little wonky when it converts into a satin stitch. It will make some decisions that don't really make sense. So what you can do is select all of your objects, right click and hit generate stitches. So this is going to simulate what your stitches will look like in the real life. And then you can hit 3D and it will actually look like a stitch. And it's also going to take your image out of the way so that you can see it more clearly. So for here, I'm just going to check to see that everything looks okay. I don't want any strange stitches. And when I say strange, it'll be pretty obvious if you see something that's weird. The stitches might not line up correctly, or they might be not evenly spaced. So if this looks a little weird right here, this last stitch here, I'm going to select that object, right click and hit edit just to see what's going on. And you can see that it does have a decent amount of nodes. It's probably more than I would personally add, but honestly, the time I save by doing this is just so worth the additional nodes and having to edit any funkiness that happens, that I'm never going to design my own satin stitches again. I think this might be solved if I delete this node here. And then what's nice is that if you edit it, you can see your original line here in pink, and you can just move your line to your original, just so that you're not losing the original detail you had. So it looks better now. Sometimes just those extra nodes can make your stitches look a little strange. Something I found with these is often, if you have a point like this, for some reason, it does one of these where the circle ends up like this, where it's beyond the node and you have to rearrange it, but it doesn't look like any of these had that issue, which is good. But I think everything looks good here. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up this design. Now we're going to do this process one more time with this tail area here. So again, you're going to create your outline object and you're going to trace around your applique line. With circles, you're going to need to add more nodes than usual. Okay. All right. So here we're going to select that object. We're going to go to convert. Oh, I'm sorry, we're going to go to transform, shrink objects by our satin stitch width, which is 2.5. And then that is our basting stitch. We are going to copy and paste that object. So now we have two of them. We're going to change the color so that we have a chance to lay down our fabric. And we're also going to change the parameters to have a smaller maximum stitch. And finally, we're going to convert to column. And we have our applique now. So I'm going to right click and generate stitches and double check what this looks like. So this looks okay to me. We'll just double check in here. Don't have any weirdness going on. Let me move that a little bit. All right. I generally don't adjust the parameters of the satin stitch. I find that the default Embird ones are just fine. So the last thing I'm going to do is trace around my pattern here. You don't have to do this, but I find it a lot easier to cut out my pattern with if I go ahead and just trace what it's supposed to look like while I embroider it. That way I don't have to do any complex lining up of my original pattern piece with what's come out of my embroidery machine. It's going to be a lot easier if you go in here and just trace around your pattern. And again, my whole pattern piece can't fit in here, but it's going to be a lot easier to figure out where the rest of it goes with tracing it. And I'm going to remove the jumps eventually because they're getting in my way, but I don't think I can do that while I'm editing this. So I have to deal with it. I'm going to end it there just because it's getting a little close to the edge of the hoop here. Now I'm going to remove these jumps. Okay, so now I've traced my pattern piece. And so the last thing we want to do here before we compile this in is change these colors of these satin stitches, which I almost forgot to do. So if I didn't change these colors, the machine embroidery would do the stitches that are going to attach the fabric and then immediately go and do the satin stitch. So you would be able to stop it on your own, but if you don't catch it, it's going to try to go ahead and do the satin stitch before you get a chance to trim the fabric. So just select all of your satin stitch, right click, hit color, and just change it to any other color. Again, it doesn't matter as long as you know what color it should be. You just want to make the machine stop here, as well as for this piece here. Okay. So there's one other trick that I want to show you, not without any background, but just something general, how I use the convert to column feature in Embird. There's also a convert to applique. So in the case that you do have an enclosed object, you can still use that same technique that I did by first drawing the outline with the outline object and then using that to convert to applique down the road, instead of having to use this create applique object where you have to draw the satin stitch yourself and make sure that it's even. You can still use my other technique. So I'm just going to demonstrate this with a circle. So I just click once and then I'm going to go to the shape option and choose an ellipse with 4 elements and draw a circle. I'm going to right click and go to elements, and then I'm going to hit check mark. So from here, you would do our same technique where you go to transform, shrink object, increase it to 2.5 or whatever your desired width of your satin stitches, hit OK. Then we are going to convert and create column from outline, change this to 2.5. And now we are going to select it again, go to convert, and change this to column to applique. So if you pay attention on the right hand side, where this little column object is, when we click this box, it's going to convert it to an applique object. So now you don't need to do the pieces where you manually create the basting stitch, the stitching line, and then the satin stitch, just by having an enclosed object and doing our technique. But after you convert it to a column, you can then go ahead and convert your column to an applique, and you can reverse it too. So there's lots of different features in this convert section that are useful. So now you can just delete this original outline because this applique shape that you've created has your basting line, your stitching line, and your satin stitch. All right. So now we can go ahead and save it, and then we can compile and put it into the Embird editor, which is this button here. So this screen is going to pop up and it's going to ask you what format you want to save your file in. I use .pes, so that's what I have selected. It has an option to center it in the hoop. I'm not going to select that because I have a 3-part hoop here. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to save it. I'm going to cancel out of the screen. And now I have my piece compiled here into the editor. So I'm not done yet. Because I have a 3-piece hoop, I have a bit more work to do. So for some reason, Embird gets rid of the boundary lines of the 3-piece hoop. So if I go back in and hit the hoop button, go to standard and select my hoop again, then it's going to show these boundary lines. So like I said, my machine can only do a 5-inch by 7-inch segment at a time. And so each of these 3 sections are 5 inches by 7 inches. So you can see this red dotted line here is the top area. This green dotted line is the middle area, and the blue dotted line is the bottom area. And you can't have a single design run over this line. It's just going to stop because your embroidery machine physically cannot go past that line. And so you have to split this design so that your pieces just fall into these these sections. Now, Embird has a feature to auto split. If you right click your design, go to split join, auto split, you can hit split in accordance with the hoop boundary, hit OK. It's going to ask if you want to separate the objects before splitting them. This process might help to avoid the disruption of separable objects. You can hit yes and see what it does, but this feature doesn't work very well. So if I click this second object here, you can see that it's decided to split this top die stripe just because it's going over this line instead of separating it off into this green section so that it wouldn't have to split up. It's just cut it in half. And I can tell you from experience, this just doesn't look good when it does it on its own and you try to make it work anyway. It just doesn't line up perfectly. So we can see what'll happen if we don't separate. You can see now that it's a bit more even with the boundaries, but it's still trying to cut that stripe. So we have to do this by hand, and it's a little tedious, but it's not as bad as it sounds. So I want to keep this top section in this red area, and I want to keep the bottom section in this blue area. And so all I have to do is tell it to basically consider it two different embroidery files. So over here, you have your list of all of your stitches, and you can just separate them accordingly. So each line, each stitch has its own little piece with its stitches, where it trims, and then where it jumps to the next stitch. And so I just want to separate out this top area. So if we think about how many stitches this top area is, we had one basting stitch, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I know I want to go ahead and separate at stitch 5. I'm going to click on the jump and right click and hit split before item. And now you can see that these basting stitches for the top stripes are just separated off on their own. So the next group of stitches are the basting stitches for the thighs. And so I'm going to go to the next color, right click, split before item, and now they're split out. So I'm just going to keep repeating this process. So these are the stitch lines. I'm going to click on the jump, right click, split before, and then the next color, right click, split before. So now I have my stitch lines separated out. So now I'm at the point where it's the satin stitches. So now it's easier to see because it's not below your satin stitches. The first stitches were below, so it didn't pop up highlighted in red. But now if you click on the stitch, you can actually see which one it's referring to. So again, I'm going to click on the jump, right click, and split before, and go to the next color, right click, split before. So now all I have left is my last piece of applique in purple here, and this one is just going to be completely encompassed in this blue area. So I'm going to go all the way down to where the final satin stitches and right click after it and split it out. And finally, I have my body outline. So this one is actually okay to split along the boundary because this is just an outline for me that I'm going to be cutting over, and it does okay with splitting straight lines, but Embird does not do okay with splitting objects clearly, as we saw. So I can just right click this and then go ahead and auto split it. So it's separated out all the individual pieces, but I can just go ahead and join them back together now. So instead of having all these individual pieces, I can select them all and join them back together. So I'm going to start with the top area. So these are the basting stitches. Now I'm going to hit Control and select my other ones that I want up here. So here's the stitches themselves. Here's the satin stitch. And now I want my upper body pieces. So it's this one right here. And this is the back piece. And then here's the tail. And I'm going to right click, go to split join and hit join. And now these pieces are back together and they're all fitting in this red space here. So now I won't get any errors when I try to save it. It's going to tell me that it crossed a hoop boundary otherwise, but now it's all encompassed in this red area. So now I'm going to do the same with the bottom section. I'm going to click my basting stitch, hit Control on my keyboard, and click all the rest of them. Right click, split join, and hit join. So now I've got two pieces. These are going to be treated basically as their own embroidery files. It's going to save as one file, but when you load it onto your embroidery machine, it's going to come up as two different files. So I've got object 1 that's in my red, and I've got object 2 that's in my blue down here. So now when we save it, you shouldn't get any errors. And again, don't hit center and hoop because it's going to mess up the way your placement is. All right, and we didn't get any errors, which means had no issues with crossing the boundaries. And just for completeness, since I did do a complex shape earlier that required having a very long hoop, I'm just going to demonstrate how you would bring this into a normal size hoop that didn't have multiple sections. So this is just a 5x7 hoop. This is my standard hoop that only has one attachment point. So all I have to do once I'm done with my design here is compile and put into Embird editor, save it as something. And now I can hit center and hoop if you want to. Like I said previously, because I had a 3-piece hoop, I can't select this because it will center the object within each section. But now that I only have a single section, I can hit center and hoop just so that I can make sure that it is perfectly in the middle. Hit OK and just save it. And I keep getting these pop-ups about saving it with a different hoop size. And essentially it's just trying to save it in the smallest hoop size possible so that your embroidery machine might not throw an error. I always say yes to this. I haven't had any issues with selecting yes. I just hit yes and then it'll save as the smallest hoop size possible and in a more compatible format, although it's still going to display your 5x7 here. But that's it. So from here, you would just load your file onto your embroidery machine, however you choose to do that, either with a USB or directly connecting your embroidery machine with a wire to your computer. So hopefully this taught you how to do applique in a couple different ways. And I think it's pretty easy once you get the hang of it. And the method I use is certainly a lot faster than drawing it all by yourself with the satin stitch width and whatnot. So the next video will cover actually going ahead and doing this applique onto our plush. And so I hope to see you there.